There's a global outcry against the so-called vaccine nationalism taking place as richer countries are accused of hoarding the jabs and looking out for their own interests alone. The World Health Organization is calling for cooperation on measures to try and stem the spread of COVID-19. But does South Africa actually have the legal tools to try fight this? Well, to explore this issue, let's bring in Dr. Franziska Sucker, who's an associate professor at the Wits School of Law. Prof, thanks very much for your time and welcome to the to the program. You know, many people say there's nothing wrong with looking out with your own people and doing that first. Given that, how would you define vaccine nationalism?
Well, it refers to a situation where countries sign advanced purchase agreements to supply their own population in a way that prevents equitable access. That has played out in a way that these advanced purchase agreements are to an amount that enables them to vaccinate their own population like several times, and that is 3-4 times, whilst at the same time others have no chance of actually accessing vaccine anymore because those amounts available are already not enough at the moment.
And, you know, much of the discussion, Prof, has been centered around, call it the hegemonic structures that exist in the world, right? So the global north is exerting its power, trying to usurp the well-being of the global south. But is enough being said about ways through which governments in the developing nation have let their own people down here?
Well, it leads to resources and it leads to capacity, manufacturing capacity. So there is an initiative in Geneva at the WTO for advocating for a waiver, for a so-called TRIPS waiver, which would enable developing world to actually produce or combine manufacturing capacity. Because at the moment, that is not, or just to a little extent possible, as long as the TRIPS flexibilities, as long as the TRIPS provisions are as they stand. So you can say letting them down, but letting them down would be referred to resources. Yeah, and right. So I think at the moment, what is important is to understand that it's more vaccine is necessary if the vaccine is efficient. Yeah, so that's and that can be done by generics and by cooperation between countries, between companies, and the current TRIPS system, which is an agreement that is part of the WTO agreements, does prevent that to an extent, at least for developing countries to combine their capacities.
Right, and that's where I was hoping we'll go. What opportunities are there still for increased bargaining power through regional bodies like the AU, SADC, etc.?
So what happens at the moment is that South Africa, specifically in India, are the forefront of trying to achieve such a waiver. A waiver would mean that the TRIPS obligations, which at the moment mean that country needs to grant IP rights at the national level, that means also patent rights for at least 20 years, that would be suspended. What does it help us? Yeah, it would help that a country could choose whether to grant IP rights and to what extent, which also means that within a country, you could suspend IP rights and then start manufacturing capacity to combine them. That means you would not have to go to time and cumbersome processes of issuing maybe a compulsory license, which is possible, but it's very long. It's a very long process and involves negotiations with the right holders. It is very costly, and it does also not include all the flexibilities that are needed. For example, it would be only directed at one country. If South Africa would issue a compulsory license, it would only mean for South African and South African citizens, which is important but there are other countries who have no manufacturing capacity, and they would not be able to import that from South Africa. So also South Africa might be in a position where they would need to import generics from other countries who are more successful, and they would not be able to do that without a waiver. So the support for the waiver at the moment is what South Africa is doing and actively doing, and that I think is the right way to do at the moment.
Yeah. For those countries that don't have that option, what else can they do outside of appealing to the moral fiber of wealthier countries to simply not hoard these jabs?
At the moment, the least developed countries at least would be able to import, because for them those provisions are not applicable. But there are other developing countries who would not fall into that, and they at the moment can't really do anything. That's really the sum total. They are reliant on the fact that the waiver is successful, so that they can at least look to countries who have the manufacturing capacity and who can maybe export to them or conclude agreements that they manufacture together. So for South Africa, it's different because they could potentially manufacture themselves, but other countries not.
Right. Thank you very much for your insight. It's certainly an important story that we'll keep watching for you throughout our fight against the pandemic. Dr. Franziska Sucker is an associate professor at Wits University. Prof, thanks very much for your time. All right.